And now I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Real World Cyberwar Lessons Learned. I'm going to hand things over to our featured presenter today. He is Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Psychotic, Joseph Carson. Joseph, you now have the floor.
Excellent, many thanks. It's a pleasure to be here and really excited about today's session. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I'm really hoping that the attendees, that you will get some interesting lessons, also some kind of real visibility into what it's like to be in a cyber war, and also some of the things to be aware of that can help society and things that you can do in order to be safer and protected. So again, my name is Joseph Carson. I'm the Chief Security Scientist at Psychotic. I've got more than 25 years in industry experience in enterprise security. I'm also a recent IS Squared Information Security Award winner in 2018, and also listed in this year's top 100 CISOs. Normally, I do speak at events globally. Normally, I do have quite an extensive travel schedule, but this year is one that has been very different. It has meant that rather than traveling and speaking at about 50 events, what I normally do globally, this year it has been closer to something like 80. Some benefits of not traveling and doing online events does mean that I can expand my reach and get to share my experience with more people. I'm also an advisor to several governments as well, doing different workshops and training and educational content, also for critical infrastructure, finance and maritime industries. And I've authored 5 books around different topics in security. And one that might be valuable for you is Cybersecurity for Dummies. It's not just for dummies, but it is also for smart people. It's something that you can read quickly and get a really good understanding about what things you can do in order to protect yourself, your employment, and also your family as well. I'm also certified foreign exchange money markets trader, and also have implemented some of the world's largest digital transformations, including large grid computing farms, and also digital transformation for an entire education system to the cloud, which has helped greatly, especially in the age that we're currently in of remote schooling and online schooling, etc. as well. So a couple of things I want to make sure as I'm talking about different areas in regards to cyber war and cyber lessons. You've heard a lot probably in the last couple of years around blockchain technologies and about how it's going to protect and save everyone. I want to make it clear, I will reference a little bit about blockchain. I will discuss a little bit about it throughout this topic and discussion, but I want to make it clear for everyone, that definitely blockchain is not going to solve all your cybersecurity problems. It's definitely, this is not the intention. There is certain things that blockchain technologies can help with and can reduce the risk, but it's not the silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything. It does have great advantages when we talk about things like cryptocurrencies and non-repudiation of data and data integrity. But it's definitely not the thing that's going to make all our lives fantastic, and it's not going to revolutionize the currency world as well. So one thing I do want to make sure is that when you probably think about what comes to your mind, and when I talk about blockchain, and when I talk about even cryptocurrencies and where it's been used and how it's been evolved, many of you are probably going to be thinking about, well, it actually goes back into cryptocurrencies. In 3rd of January 2009 is when Satoshi Nakamoto came out with kind of the papers and the revelation of cryptocurrencies, and that being Bitcoin. And that's what most people think about when you think about blockchain and you think about its usage and think about its implementations. Most people think about blockchain going back into 2009, and that's where people think that it started, and that's where they think that the revolution and evolution of that came from. But actually, it's been around for much longer, many years back. And I always ask people about, when do you think that this really started? Give me a date or give me an idea. And some people think around the 90s when we think about digital computing and the internet boom. And then some people just come back and try to get an understanding. But actually, when we talk about blockchain and even kind of the where it started off, actually goes back into 1979. 1979 is when it all started. It was really around the time when computers become more connected, when you started connecting devices together. It really started off that when you wanted to transfer a file from one computer and get it successfully to another computer, what basically was the problems back in 1979 was that networks were not as stable. you had a lot of corruption during transfers. You had a lot of problems getting data from one computer to another. And this really kind of meant that, the evolution, kind of really innovation around how to make sure that the data was successfully transferred. And ultimately, this meant that in 1979, that some of the ideas came around that basically ensure the stability of files going from one computer to another. And this was known as the Merkle tree, and it comes from a person called Ralph Merkle. And ultimately, he came up with this methodology around making sure that as data transferred from one computer to another, that you'd take a fingerprint of that file, known as a fingerprint or hashing, and then compare that hash with the results once it was actually transferred to the destination computer. And this was basically the ability to confirm that the transfer completed successfully. So this is really the kind of the starting of the Merkle tree itself. Now, I'm always one for thinking about, I'd like to step back and try to think about this and what does it look like in the real world? What is an example in the physical world that we experience? That this is really where I like to kind of get in this practicality and thinking about, in the physical world, what would be blockchain? What would be a Merkle tree to make sure that one's data integrity is maintained and that you prevent, the ability for abusing of that data. And I think about, when I think about the physical world, we can even go back into centuries. We can go back into hundreds of years when actually this was put in practice. What you're saying right now was put in practice many, many times. And one that comes to mind that, if we were to think about a physical world example of this, is really the Bible itself. The Bible, it's not to say that I'm saying what is in the Bible is accurate, but the concept and the idea of preventing manipulation or preventing abuse or the data being modified without authorization. This is really, if you think about, you had a number of people, the disciples, get together and decide that this is the evidence of events. The Bible is basically a series of events and documented of those events. It was agreed upon and then documented. In order to prevent it from being modified, was that it was basically copied and produced many, many times and distributed globally. And this is really the concept, is that when you basically modify one copy, basically everyone else's copy remains basically intact and you can compare and verify. And this is basically the emphasis. So the Bible is a good example of what blockchain would be like in the physical world, that it gets widely distributed as a series of events that was agreed upon. So this is kind of really the emphasis. So moving into, I'm based here in Tallinn, Estonia, and I want to talk about Estonia's journey. It will kind of discuss around cybersecurity and lessons learned from different cyberwar, the elements and what Estonia has basically been doing around the innovation in digital society. So I think it's really important to kind of take you through this journey and to really emphasize and kind of give you a bit of kind of history and context, because this is what's really important in the world that we live in today. Sometimes context is missing and sometimes left behind. And this is really kind of the point, is to taking you through this journey to understand about the history, how Estonia got to where it is today, and some of the kind of lessons learned and some of the experiences and some of the innovations that's happened through that time. So Tallinn in Estonia is a very interesting place. And I think really kind of to get an idea into the country itself is that it is on the borders, outskirts of Europe, and does have a border with Russia, and it has a border with Latvia. And then basically not far is, of course, Finland and Sweden. So the area itself is about 45,000 kilometers square. The population around 1.4 million people. It does have a bit of a diverse population. This is mostly from its history of being occupied many times. It's been occupied by Germany, by Sweden, by Russia. So there's many over the years. There's been different occupations, and it's definitely diversified the population quite significantly. There's been multiple significant dates around independence in 24th of February 1918. And then, of course, there was the occupation during World War II. And then there was the independence was restored then later in the 20th of August 1991. So some significant dates. And just to give you an idea, kind of geographical wise, where Estonia is located. Now, with that, one of the things that goes to kind of back into where I think this story best is told, where basically the beginning is going back to August 20th, 1991. And this is really kind of where Estonia became its second independence, a re-independence. And as it became an independent country then, and this was known as back as the Singing Revolution that happened in the late kind of 80s, early 90s, when the breakup of the Soviet Union. And at that time, you had a government that was very young and being formed. It was also significant. It was the boom of the internet as well, was starting off at that time. Now, what happened was that there was some challenges as well becoming independence, was that when you're occupied for such a long time, you realize that all the documents that you have been modified, have been, depending on which is the ruling kind of nation state, they determine your education, they determine the language that you speak, they determine what history is. They modify land ownership, they modify, basically, they control the education knowledge of the country itself. So when you have an occupying state, they're really in control of basically what the information flow is. And in this particular case, is that one of the major challenges that Estonia had was that when it became independent was understanding land ownership. There was these known as communes, that basically land was shared, and then basically when it was independent, it was basically getting given back to the previous landowners. And this was a major problem because all of the documents and legal frameworks had been manipulated during that occupation. And this became a major challenge. So one of the things that as Estonia was becoming kind of starting off as government and getting its foothold, and a lot of people were coming back into Estonia and kind of rediscovering their family's history in the land. Estonia decided that make sure that moving forward from this time, from 1991, to make sure that as they move forward, they want to make sure that, basically as they were taking this kind of path as being what was known as the digital age, we're moving into focusing around the internet and taking advantage of it. And actually one of the things was the pamphlet back at that time, they actually downloaded a 5-page pamphlet about how to start your own government from the internet. And that was really kind of some of the emphasis of a kind of groundbreaking start. But in 1991, what they wanted to make sure is that as they moved down this digital path, that they wanted to make sure that data could not be manipulated. So as they were going down this paperless society, they wanted to make sure that in this kind of make sure that basically their past could never be changed again. They wanted to make sure that in the digital society, the history could never be erased, could never be modified. And this was one of the emphasis. So what they did back in 1991 was they got all of their smart scientists together. They got their mathematicians, their cryptographers, their computer scientists, programmers. They got them together and said, right, we're going down now this path of being a paperless society. We want to make sure that the history can never be erased. We want to make sure that there's integrity into what we do on the internet. So they sent off their scientists. They all went into the forest, probably into the woods, and started kind of figuring out how do we solve this problem, how to make sure that history can never be erased or modified in a digital scenario. So basically, many years passed, and Estonia started becoming kind of more innovative. They started getting into the more Western world. And it was many years later, in 1998, when those scientists, mathematicians, and cryptographers came out of the forest. It was actually interesting because they actually published the paper in 1997, but it was 1998 when they revealed their findings. And they found that basically in a digital scenario, how can we make sure that history can never be erased or modified online in the digital world? They actually came out basically saying that the idea was blockchain. And back in 1998, it was actually known as an alternative. It was known as timestamping, known as fingerprinting. It was actually, known making sure that you take a timestamp of a piece of data, and therefore you embed time into it, making sure that later it cannot be modified. So basically, this was the foundation that Estonian government really found, that to make sure that their history can never be erased again like it was previously, that they were going to look at blockchain as the possibility. Going back, and of course, the foundation of that being the Ralph Merkle and the Merkle tree, into making sure that data could not be manipulated or poisoned. So this meant that in order to achieve this, they realized that the actual foundation of this is that in order to make sure that it was possible, they realized that timestamping or fingerprinting or blockchain alone was not possible by itself. So they realized that they need to have multiple elements. It's like you want to make, it's a recipe. In order to make that work correctly, they realized that they needed multiple components. In order for it to be successful, they realized they needed a digital identity, something that digitally could kind of validate a user's identity. And this is really the introduction of the Estonian ID card back in 1999. Now, this was something that's not new. This was something that had been tried in other countries, such as in Finland and in UK, but ultimately it had a challenge because ultimately it was seen as a way for the government to oversee or to provide some type of identification. But Estonians kind of took a different approach. They seen it as something that could be enabling a front door, enabling a communication of transparency between the citizen and the government. So they realized very quickly that they needed an identity card in order to provide some type of identification when citizens were interacting with the government. But they realized alone that the ID card itself wasn't enough. So in March 2000, they actually introduced what was known as, this is one of the first legal elements, was they introduced digital signature. So one of the first countries in the world to actually legalize a digital signature. So this was now basically, they started having the ingredients. They had a digital identity in order to provide proof of identity. They also had digital signature or provide proof of verification or authorization. And also they added in time as well. They put a time element. And putting all of these agreements together, they had the foundation of what was then possible in order to create basically a blockchain implementation for the government. So now a few years, they realized they now had the recipe and the understanding about what they wanted to achieve. And by that stage, they had already changed kind of their path and direction. They no longer wanted to be just a paperless society. They decided that in order to basically be successful, they actually evolved and they decided that this is now the foundation of what Estonia called was the digital society. So this was significant. And one of the introductions, they started basically looking at, well, now we're going into no longer just paperless, but now it's about being digital. It's about being able to provide all government services online and make it available to the citizens easily, with accuracy, with non-repudiation, with authenticity, with verification. So this was really kind of the start of making sure that Estonia could really provide those services to the society. And through this, they actually created what was then known as X-Road. And X-Road was really the digital services that the government introduced. Now, it started with just a few services at the beginning. It started with things like online banking, with basically the population register, with online tax, with document and record management as well. So these were some of the initial areas that they started with. Now, with each of these, each register or these data repositories in the background, population register, things like energy, telcos, and banks, they are all basically kept separate. They're kept decentralized, so they're de-risking of each other, and they only maintain the specific data that's applicable to those repositories. So your name will be kept in the population register, your home address in the register, your bank details in the bank, your contact details, they will all be kept separately. So therefore, what they do is they provide sharing of this information across the different repositories. So that you'll publish what you have from a metadata perspective and allow other repositories to ask the right question. Where does this person live, so I can actually send information to them? How can I contact them? So this de-risking, and that means that you have prevention of duplication of data, your prevention of basically of one database being compromised, that it doesn't mean the rest of the data is also compromised as well. And then you have these security servers, which basically does the auditing and logging. And it's a security service which provides the ability to make sure that as data is accessed, modified, updated, and requested, that all of that goes into basically the actual root hash that then goes into the calendar database, which is basically the emphasis over the blockchain signing. And you'll also have different security views where you'll log into the portal and you'll have what you're able to see from basically the role that you're playing. If you're a citizen, you'll be able to audit your own records and be able to see who's accessing from the government. You'll be able to see not the actual individual, but you'll see that access records has been requested. If you went to see a doctor, you'll be able to see that a doctor requested access to medical records. If you got a speeding ticket, you'll be able to see that a police officer accessed your vehicle registration information. So all of this is making sure that one is that there's the ability for the citizen to see their data, but also provide auditability and self-auditability of the interactions and access of that data as well. And if you're a public servant, like a doctor or a politician, you'll log into these portals to be able to see what's applicable to you. So this provides ability of, one is transparency to the citizen, ability of ease of service as well. And this also enabled things like tax returns to be done in minutes. In Estonia now, the average tax return takes somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes. Online voting as well was introduced into this. So this was a significant foundation of the digital services. And it really kind of meant that Estonia was no longer just seeing the government as being a digital society, but it actually was the transformation into the government being a service provider. Ultimately, they see themselves as there to continue providing and improving services to the citizens, and that is the role of the government. It's not there to govern, but they're there to serve the citizens. And Estonia really kind of put that emphasis around the transformation from being a digital society to being a service provider of services. And they want to make sure that those services continue to improve and actually provide efficiency, to provide inclusivity, meaning that all citizens now have the opportunity to interact with the government as well. So this was a significant introduction, and was very, very widely accepted, especially when citizens seen that the improvements that they had around doing tax returns, that they were able to improve efficiency, reduce wasted time, reduce standing in long queues, especially what you're seeing right now in other countries, and that sometimes the time and amount of wasted time in doing some of those services can significantly be reduced. And even modifying data such as your contact information, your home address, can be easily maintained from the citizens themselves. So then moving forward, so this was kind of now the introduction of that digital society and service provider from the government. And Estonia took some significant steps. In March 29th, 2004, it then became part of NATO. And May 1st, 2004, it joined the EU. And this was a significant because up until this point, its border relationships and trade relationships and economic relationships was still mostly to the east, with Russia and the former Soviet Union countries. And this was a significant change that Estonia decided to take a different direction and move more Western focused. And this was a significant kind of indication to Russia and other countries that Estonia was now looking to the West for trade and economic advantages and partnerships. So these were the significant dates, and it was quite a changing times, especially for the country itself. So then moving forward to, it was in 2005 that using this X-Road and using this service provider focus, that it was the first country to introduce internet voting. And this was a significant exception because, of course, the impact that it can have. And it's not to say that it's the only method. There still is basically paper ballots. There still is electronic voting, which most people would be familiar with. And it also, it allows people to then have much more transparency, much more ability to be flexible. So in 2005, basically, they allowed the ability for citizens to be able to vote kind of when the voting poll opened, and you could change your vote multiple times. You could actually decide and modify your vote. It's only the last one that gets counted. It means that basically, you have the ability to, if somebody says something, a politician says something you don't like, you can then go later and change. It prevents collusion for people buying votes. It prevents those early kind of trending where people will follow who's winning. So significant advantages of this ability, and also allows each system to oversee each other. With the paper ballots, with the electronic and the internet voting, you can provide indications of potential, making sure that integrity is maintained because they will tend to have similar traits. It also allows people that are in different employments. You might have, shift working workers. You might have people that's in remote villages. You might, have limitations in having not to travel long distances to the polling booths. You don't have to wait long times an hour, in queues. You have the ability for families who are quite busy to not waste their time. They now have the ability to expand more inclusivity and more people voting. And of course, making sure, it's with the registration of those votes is also important as well. So this was significant to make sure that you provide much more capabilities to make the ability for voting much more widely accepted and much more inclusive of the citizens. At the time, I think, the internet voting was around probably somewhere between 20% of the votes. And that's now significantly increased in around about 30%, 35% of voting. And we expect this year, especially with the pandemic and people, working remotely and from home and with the closures, etc., that people will still be able to vote significantly in the elections in Estonia, because it also allows them to vote from a safe location as well. So this was a significant change in modification, and also was an adoption and was widely accepted. There still is the skeptics out there. A lot of people don't like to change. They don't like to, move away from, what they were used to. But for most citizens, it is a benefit of being able to evolve and to be able to innovate and embrace technology, at the same time putting the right controls in place to reduce the risk of it being compromised. Then after this, things kind of moved along quite normally. Everything was great. There was innovations, there was things like the health details being then included into this digital society, prescriptions being online. So more services were being added over time to improve that ability to serve the citizens. But then in April 27, 2007, it actually took a different direction. It was a bit of a disruption at that time. Estonia kind of had really we're still adopting blockchain to provide that non-repudiation and make sure the history can never be erased. They had the digital society and everything was going forward and going great. But in 2007, what happened was we had the government decided to move a bronze statue, which was known as the victory, the fallen soldier. And this was to celebrate Victory Day, which was basically Russia Victory Day. And this statue was in the city center of the city. And they decided to move the statue to a bit more of the outskirts of the city center to a graveyard. And this was seen as basically, a significant oppression of the Russian citizens or Russian-speaking citizens in Estonia. It's important to also recognize that while there's a lot of Russian-speaking people in Estonia, they are still Estonian citizens. They're just Russian-speaking. That's their primary mother tongue. But this decision to move the statue was significant, and during the time, actually on the streets in Estonia, there was violence erupted, and the police were basically looking to disperse and to reduce the violence, and that was seen as some type of significant oppression to the Russian-speaking population in Estonia. And this was basically again condemned by the Russian embassies and Eastern countries, but this was something that kind of continued, and the Estonians basically were looking at ways to reduce the violence, and ultimately resulted in a cyber war. So when you're looking at thinking about myself, and I think about my time back in Estonia, I'm not originally Estonian, I've been here for almost 20 years, but when I think about during that time, that many citizens here were the survivors of one of the first cyber wars. We end up having a significant, while that statue was being moved and there was some violence in the streets, there was then the start of this significant attack on Estonia's nation state from a cyber perspective, from the cyber realm. And this really started to targeting the main websites. For example, the Estonian presidency and its parliament were targeted, the country's ministries, political parties, news organizations, banks, the telecommunications companies, all targeted from basically DDoS attacks, defacing of websites. Significant cyber war was happening at that time. And it was actually one of the second biggest DDoS attack, I think, since the Reagan DDoS attack back in the early 2000s. So this was significant. You think about this was what was happening in 2007. Imagine if this was to happen today, a cyber war, when we have so much more services online, especially in multiple countries, especially medical facilities, logistics is happening. All of those things are now taking place online. But in 2007, they still had limitations around that, but it was still a significant impact. And we had websites defaced with the Victory Day, Freedom, and the Fallen Soldier. Some of the significant DDoS attacks. And this also gets into the lessons learned. One of the things that when you think about how you respond to attacks, and a particular bank, as it was responding to a cyber attack at that time, they actually triggered their fault tolerance. They actually did a restore and brought up another service online. And actually, the way that they responded to the incident actually caused them more problems. Because the DDoS attack was intermittent, so the service was coming up and down. But when they actually did their fault tolerance and actually brought up another service in order to deal with this issue, the old service was still coming up and down. And it meant that basically, after the cyber attack had ended, they actually end up now having two truths of transactions. They had two services running side by side. And actually how they responded to the attack was actually more severe than the attack itself. So it's really important to understand when you're actually having a cyber attack or a DDoS attack to respond with the right response accordingly. So make sure you think through how you respond to attack. And this was significant because ultimately it meant that they had to have these two systems now running side by side for the remainder of the year until they were able to purge and move and merge those transactions in different systems together. So it's really important to understand about when you do respond appropriately with the right method depending on the type of attack that's happening. So one thing that increased at that point in time and brought back a realization, because Estonia had realized that they'd implement this ability to make sure that history can never be erased. However, one thing that happened during that time was that Estonia does have a land border with Russia, our very noisy neighbor. And at the time, they were doing training exercises, military exercises on the border. And one of the realizations was at the time was that while Estonia had, in a sense, of a digital ability for non-repudiation and protecting of the history from being erased, one of the realizations was all the data and services are centrally located in Estonia. They're in the physical land in Estonia. And if a land invasion ever happened at that point in time, basically you could erase and destroy the data centers where that data is stored. And this was a realization that actually Estonia had solved it only in the digital realm, but not in the physical side. You could still destroy that basically, history in a physical scenario. It was a significant realization that that was a problem that we hadn't solved. We solved it digitally, but not physically. So at that point in time, this was called the Doomsday Scenario. It was called the scenario that if ever there was a land invasion, what we had actually set back in 1991, and the ideas that was actually put together in 1998 and actually was implemented in 2002, all of that digital kind of emphasis, we've kind of forgot about the physical side of things. If you ever destroyed the data center, the raw data, then you're still not solving that actually prevention. So this actually made a realization that actually created a significant focus around how to make sure that this can be prevented in the future. So this Doomsday Scenario brought together some of the smartest people from around the world to Estonia to try and figure out how to make sure that in a physical scenario that Estonia could actually become more resilient to not only digital cyber attacks, but also physical attacks as well that can have cyber implications. So back in August 2008, this was some of the kind of, they had the Internet for Security. You also had the NATO set up the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia in order to come up and solve how do we prevent this type of land invasion from actually impacting the history of Estonia as well. So this actually meant that kind of really thinking outside the box. There was many things that was attempted looking at, well, let's put Estonia data outside of the country. And actually what prevented that from happening, if you think about decentralizing, because my input and my expertise was around the DDoS prevention, was in order to reduce the risk of DDoS, you had to actually be decentralized. You had to have multiple locations that will actually de-risk the actual impact of a DDoS attack. So ultimately, some of the ideas was that how do we do this, and then the recommendation was put the data in multiple countries. But ultimately, the upper courts and the senior courts in the country said that's not possible because we're not allowed to actually move the citizens' data into land outside of this not sovereign of Estonia. So this created a lot of challenges that we started having to think outside the box. How can we actually move Estonia beyond the borders of Estonia? How do we actually reduce the risk of a land invasion and DDoS attacks to reduce that impact? So this kind of got a lot of ideas and thinking out of the box, and there was a lot of amazing people that was involved at this point in time. So back in around 2008, 2009, the idea was then introduced of creating virtual data embassies. So how to move the data and sovereign data of citizens in Estonia to other locations in the country, but still being protected under the law of Estonia. And the idea was then to move the data into the actual embassies in other countries. So this was an area, of course, embassy locations in other countries are still sovereign land of the country and also abide by the laws. So the idea was then to decentralize Estonia, leveraging the embassy locations and actually creating these virtual embassies. And this is a significant idea into looking at how to make sure that Estonia could become, let's say, more resilient to these types of cyber attacks. So ultimately, kind of putting and ultimately the idea was in 5 different locations to decentralize, which means that there's not 5 separate locations where you would need to attack in order to prevent Estonia's government from operating. The reason for 5 was you needed an odd number because you need to have this digital voting system, especially for the blockchain and the root hash to be calculated. And also you need to be able to do maintenance. So if you only had 3 and you take 1 server down, then that meant that you still had an even number, so you can have an odd number. So in order to do it, you needed to have 5 locations. And that meant that when you're doing maintenance, you take 2 down and therefore you still have an odd number for that voting capability to occur. So this was a significant move forward, and ability for Estonia kind of to then innovate. So Estonia truly did become, at this point in time, a digital society, a e-government. This now meant that actually the government, if ever there was a land invasion or an attack on Estonians' land location, that the country can still operate without actually having a physical land. It's completely separated the dependency in a digital scenario of the land itself and its digital, basically, society. So Estonia still, without physical land, can operate, can vote, can actually do tax returns, can actually see its digital data independent of the physical location. So this was a significant innovation moving forward. Now, one of the things that realized that Estonia's data embassies and embassy locations themselves are not kind of full resilient. They're not data center quality locations. So this was realization, and then they decided that they needed to move this embassy locations to true data centers. So in around 2015, 2016, they realized that they're going to start moving them. Originally, the original location was going to be in the UK. Over a little thing that kind of put some spanner in the works was Brexit. So ultimately, then there had to be alternative locations decided, and ultimately in Estonia, they ultimately decided that the first true embassy location was going to be in Luxembourg. So in 2017, set up a data embassy location in Luxembourg, which now is a physical kind of embassy location, which actually they delegated part of the actually data center itself to being an embassy of Estonia. So now really getting into that Estonia is truly a decentralized digital society. So this is significant ability to move forward and take advantages of this. So it becomes very difficult for any country to do a cyber attack against Estonia, because it does mean that you're not just attacking one country, you're attacking multiple countries. And some of those countries might be your allies, that might be bigger than you. So it really truly made Estonia kind of from a digital society be much stronger, much more resilient to cyber attacks. And to the point where, and actually just recently, 2 years ago, the president of Estonia actually indicated that we are not the first company to use blockchain at a national level. Also, it invests significantly into e-health programs every year, and is now kind of less concerned about cyber attacks. The biggest problem we have today is no longer from a cyber attack itself, is truly from misinformation and disinformation is really the major challenge. And the way I look at it is that with those types of cyber attacks where the targets disinformation and misinformation, that they're really kind of doing polarization of societies. It's really not trying to attack the elections or voting systems or politicians. What it's trying to do is basically, when you think about it, it's not a hack on elections, and it's not a hack on citizens' data. When countries are in information wars, or disinformation wars, or misinformation wars, depending on the terminology that you prefer to use, it's not attacking the citizen, it's not attacking the country or the vote or the systems themselves. It's actually attacking democracy. That's what's truly happening, is when countries decide to target in disinformation and information wars, they're actually targeting the democracy itself, is to target the untrust of systems, to create distrust in the society itself. And that's what we're at today, is when countries are targeting the voting and targeting registration databases and targeting campaigns and targeting basically health systems and government systems. When they're targeting that, that's an attack on democracy. And it's ultimately, the outcome is not to determine who wins a vote or who wins an election. It's ultimately to determine is to create distrust in the system. And that's the threat that we have. It's not the outcome of who wins, it's actually the outcome of polarization and separation of the trust of the systems that we have in place. And that's ultimately what we have at risk. And that's why it's really important to kind of take some of these lessons from Estonia's experience and to really look at what is the risks that we expose. If you're playing a game of chess, it's not about the next move, it's about the next 3 to 4 moves. It's thinking ahead, it's thinking like the attacker, and this is what we need to get into. So the lessons that I've got is, what can we learn from Estonia's experience? What can we learn from the history? What can we learn from knowing why Estonia started out its path was to make sure that history can never be erased, and also to provide services to the citizen. to provide reduced wasted time, to provide benefits and transparency between the citizen and the government, to getting to a true democracy. So the lessons I can share with you that I've learned from my experience in this whole kind of my lifetime in Estonia is cyberwar is here and it's going to happen, and has multiple kind of, let's say, mechanisms. It's not just a digital only. It also has kinetic impact. It can impact you physically. It can impact society. We look at some of the attacks that has happened, where healthcare has been targeted, hospitals been targeted, can actually have a real impact on life. There is a kinetic, let's say, a kinetic impact when cyber attacks do happen. It can actually impact and cost people their lives. One of the things is, as a global world that we're in, transparency and cooperation is the only way forward. We have to work together. It's not about one or the other. It's not about individualism or nationalism. We need multiple countries to work together in the cyber realm. The internet is interconnected. There is no borders on the internet. So for us, we have to work together in order to provide less places that actually criminals can operate. We have the whole countries who harbor and provide safe havens for cyber criminals. We have to hold them accountable. And this does mean that as countries around the world need to come together, need to be transparent to each other about what's happening, to make sure that there's no place that they're actually going to provide safe havens for cyber criminals, and the cooperation together to provide a legal framework in order to make sure that we actually have the ability to work together to make the internet a safer place, not just for one country, but for everybody. Because again, the internet doesn't have borders. It doesn't have limitations in regards to basically, data transfer and so forth. You can try to do that, but ultimately technology will overcome that. Decentralization is key to mitigating DDoS attacks. We have to make sure that we're not basically centralizing everything into one location. We had to think about resiliency. We had to think about the ability to continue, and that means decentralization. It means to make sure that data is decentralized, which means that if one becomes compromised, it doesn't impact all of them. And also means that if one becomes compromised, we can continue with the other data sets moving forward. Data embassies is a key solution for being basically a global society to make sure that small countries and locations around the world can actually become very resilient to also attacks on those countries. So data embassies is a key solution for data sovereignty. And this is something that legal frameworks such as GDPR has been attempting in order to provide as some type of legal framework on data itself. And also digital identity and privileges is really the foundation to all of this. This is really kind of the basis of how to make sure that countries and governments and societies can provide services to the citizens. It's about providing a front door. It's about making sure that citizens have the right and the ability to see their data. And it also gets into that it's not just about, data itself, and data isn't new oil. It's, it's our time. Our time is what's the valuable thing here. It's not about we being the product, and it's not data being the new oil. It's about time is basically the most valuable thing that we have. And this what it gets into is that data is associated to that, to ourselves and time. And therefore, that's what we really need to get into, is making sure. And also, when we talk about data, the whole problem with things like social media and government access and other tech providers is that it's all about making sure that it's about data rights management issue here. It's about making sure that people have the right and the visibility, and about data ownership and data profitability and data value and tangible areas of that. And that's really what it gets into. Identity and privileges is key to the foundation to make sure that we, as the value of our time as possible, and to make sure that we can become more resilient and make sure that our data and our time is not being abused. And this gets me to my last statement, is that absolutely, as you heard here, a little bit about blockchain, a little bit about cyber war, lessons learned, and me being a survivor of the cyber war, that I can tell you now that blockchain is not going to solve all of your cybersecurity problems. And one of the things I do have for you and the audience is that, understanding how cyber criminals think and hackers think is one of the best ways in order to understand how you yourself can defend against cyber attacks. That's one of the critical things. And one of the things I've learned is that while I'm a cybersecurity professional with many years experience, is that I'm only secure as the society around me. I'm only secure as the people that I'm connected with, my social sphere. And that's what's really important, is that in order to become resilient, doesn't mean better secure systems. And it doesn't mean better secure me. It means better secure all of us. As we as a society become more aware and more kind of, let's say, conscious about what's happening, is that we can do the things together in order to become more resilient to cyber attacks. So it means that it's not just about cybersecurity awareness, it's about a cyber secure society. It's about all of us working together and not being afraid to ask other people for advice. Don't be afraid to ask for advice on cybersecurity best practices, and make sure that we actually do this together. So at this point in time, I'm happy to open up for questions from the audience, and I hope that my experience and lessons from Estonia and some of the things that my thoughts and opinions have been valuable. But I think it's really important for National Cybersecurity Awareness Month and for everyone out there to get a kind of understanding about what can happen, what things a country can do, and ultimately it gets into your hands. You have the responsibility and accountability in order to make sure that we can protect society and protect our way of life and democracy in the future. So I think it's really important. Please do, if you do have questions, put them into the question. I'll be happy to answer as many as I can. I'm always happy to kind of give my thoughts. If you are interested in, following me, do, connect with me on social media. I am available on LinkedIn, and also very sharing my research and sharing my thoughts and kind of responses to different texts out there on Twitter as well. So please make sure to keep in contact with me. So any questions out there, I'd be happy to answer. If you have
Sure. Thank you so much, Joseph. Everyone, if you have any questions, please take a moment to type your questions into the questions menu box, and then we'll just get to them in a few minutes while everyone's taking some time to do that. Just wanted to say that if you're interested in the material that Joseph presented in this webinar, or if you just have questions in general regarding what's available in terms of cybersecurity course offerings, make sure to contact your local center for more information. You can log on to newhorizons.com, do a quick zip code search for the centers nearest you, and you can connect with to get more information there. Just a quick reminder, this session is being recorded, so you can also share that with anyone who's missed the session today, or pass it along to colleagues who might find this interesting, or just to review yourself as well. So please feel free to keep typing in your questions as we dive into a few that have come in here. So Joseph, the first question that came in is, do you ever see the US moving to an online voting model?
Absolutely, yes. However, one of the things is that the US voting model is very complex, and it's very decentralized. One of the good things about the voting model in the US is it's very decentralized, which is for me a positive. It's taken that same model Estonia has from the embassy side of things. So it does make hacking the election more difficult because it's decentralized. Every state is responsible for what happens in their states and the counties and so forth. So online voting and internet voting, it's always important to make sure the difference between electronic voting, which is going to a machine and pushing a button, versus internet voting, meaning that from any devices you own, that you can securely vote from any location online to the internet. So I do see the US moving to a model like that. However, it will most likely be a phased approach and will happen at a state level and not a federal level, just because of the complexities and different kind of, I don't see the federal government coming to an agreement or being able to kind of put these in place. They might put best practices in place or frameworks, but it will be done at a state level first. And I think it's really important here because I think, when we're looking at the elections at the moment, I'm sitting watching on the news, every day, watching people standing for 8, 9, 10 hours that, and being able to only vote, at one time. And then if somebody says something that you disagree with, that's something that you can change. People are spending hours voting with 3 weeks, 2 weeks ahead of the outcome of the elections is the moment. And, taking Estonia, you could do that in a minute. One of the things, as I mentioned, the most important value that we have is our time. And if you were to kind of think about, well, would you accept something? Would you rather spend 8 to 10 hours in electronic voting booths in places that you could get infected versus being able to pick up your phone and vote from the ease of your own home in your own time, especially not taking a day off work, etc. So there is significant benefits. I do predict one of the things that the benefits that I didn't mention of Estonia's system is the benefit to the actual economy, and it does reduce wasted time significantly. That actually up to 6 days GDP of the country is actually, the wasted time is reduced every year. And if you think about that, if you took that into a US level, the simple, system like this, would reduce 6% of the US economy, would be 1 trillion per year saved. So I think that there is an economical advantage of doing it. I think there's this inclusivity advantage of doing it. And I think, though, it will be done at the state level, not at the federal level. Federal level would later come with potentially best practices and frameworks, though.
Great answer. Another question that did come in is, to your point about our own security sphere, what is an effective means of conveying effective methods and processes to friends, families, and coworkers that will be effectively received, as, I guess, dismissed as fodder? Hopefully I answered that correctly.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things we have to think about is just mostly some of the basic things is simply just even password hygiene. It's getting people to choosing smarter, wiser passwords. And I think that ultimately we need to move away from leaving password creation, changing decisions to humans. We're not very good at it. It's clear we have poor decisions when it comes to choosing password. Many people will have, a capital letter at the beginning. They'll have a number at the end with an exclamation mark. A common we just get into being, choosing our very secret, very, private word. We're just not very good at it. So we had to get into practice of making sure that we use things like password managers to get away from having to create and generate passwords ourselves, and get back to having one good long password that we can remember, using a passphrase, for example. And don't be afraid to put things like spaces in random areas. So, just if you take 3 random words that you have that you can think about, and, let's take, apple, banana, and orange. And rather than putting spaces between the words, you can put them in random places that only you know. So that will make a much more complicated, stronger password, that would be difficult to crack, just because of that simple randomness that you're putting into there, especially in the long passphrase. So we just have to, in a society, get, reduced in times that we need to choose passwords, use a password manager. And it gets into also being more conscious about what types of apps you're installing in your mobile devices, and being aware about, the data collection that's happening. And the thing that people don't realize when you install an app on your phone is that it starts to have access to more information than what you think about. You might think about a simple messaging app, or let's say a social media app that you're just looking randomly at different feeds. The information that's collecting is not just about, your login, that I'm logged in from this time to this time. It has access to much more, things like your microphone, your camera, your location information, your browsing history. So we need to become more aware into the type of data that those apps are collecting from us, and also being more aware about choosing better security controls when we're logging into systems from passwords.
That's awesome. That's a great question, answer to that question here. Another question that did come in is, the person says, I'm not a cybersecurity professional, and this might be too basic for this audience or session today, but what as an individual are some of the best things we can do to protect our digital identity when it comes to banks, healthcare, other sites? I know you kind of mentioned it here with, password hygiene, but what are the other things that you suggest that people can do just to protect that digital ID that we have?
That's a great question. I think, and there's no basically simple questions. These are all very, very good questions. And I think it's really important is just being aware into where you're typing things into. When you're basically, just being much more conscious about looking around for the URL, making sure you're using systems that are up to date, patching systems, choosing a very good, strong password. All those simple things can make it much more difficult. When you're talking about your digital identity, really depending on where you're using that identity, adding simple things like two-factor or multi-factor authentication will just make it a little bit more difficult for attackers to abuse it as well. So I've always learned that it's always taking those little steps to make it much more difficult, because one example, a metaphor I will say is that when I lived in, I'm originally from Belfast, and it was car theft was a big problem. So what you tend to do is that when you're parking your car, you tend to park it next to a nicer car that is more valuable than yours, and put a little bit of extra security on it. So it's like the bear story, is that you don't need to basically outrun a bear. You just need for the other person to be a little bit slower than you. So this is really kind of, from a security perspective, is that we just need to take those little steps that will make it much more difficult and turn the focus from attackers from opportunistic attacks to you look in alternative ways. We just need to make it that a little bit more difficult. So protecting your identity, choosing a good password, and using additional two-factor, multi-factor authentication is typically enough. And change your password at least once a year, not leaving it the same forever.
That's awesome. Well, those were the few questions that we did have come in. I know we're at the top of the hour. Thank you again, Joseph, for presenting on behalf of New Horizons. We appreciate the information that you've been sharing with us. And for everyone who's joined us today, thank you for taking the time to spend with us as well. If you haven't already, we do have a lot more webinar sessions in the upcoming weeks. Even for the rest of this week, if you haven't registered, please feel free to join us and register for those as well. With that being said, thank you again, Joseph. Thank you, everyone. The webinar is now concluded, and you may now log off. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and stay safe and secure. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thank you.